Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome to another one of these 1/18th scale model car looking at videos. Today we have got for your viewing pleasure the 2003 McLaren MP4-18. The MP4-18 is a very interesting piece, and it's a really cool model to have because, as those of you may know, the MP4-18 never actually saw action in anger. It was essentially a development effort gone very, very wrong in the 2003 season by McLaren Mercedes at the time. The car was designed by Adrian Newey, and it was designed to be a radical departure from the MP4-17D, which saw out the rest of 2002 with McLaren International. 2002 was a rather disappointing season for McLaren after having been squarely trounced by Ferrari and their all-conquering F2002. However, Adrian Newey and the McLaren design office thought, hey, we've got ourselves an opportunity for a clean slate, let's design a radical new car, and this is what they came up with, the McLaren MP4-18. The problem with the MP4-18 though, well, I should say problems plural because there were many problems with this car. Adrian Newey always has been a visionary designer. He's always tried radical new things, and a lot of his designs build on each other over the years, and we'll have a look at that later on. However, Adrian Newey designing a few traits into this car which really were revolutionary and very advanced for their day, very much ahead of their time. Additionally, there are some things on this car which do harken back to an earlier time, and we'll have a look at all of those features as well. The first thing that we should say is that this, being from the 2003 season, is a V10 car. Yes, it is a glorious example of that wonderful V10 era. 3-liter V10 engine, normally aspirated, running through a 7-speed semi-automatic paddle-shift gearbox. Yes. To be specific, the engine is the Mercedes-Benz Type FO110M. It is a 72-degree bank angle on that V10. We could estimate about 880 horsepower coming out of this thing. This is 2003, so we are coming up toward the end of the V10 era, and those engines, of course, by this point had reached their absolute zenith of development. 2003 also the last year in which the teams did not have to have any engine conservation going on, really, which meant that these guys could change engines after every session if they really wanted to, and the front-running teams pretty much did do that. So these engines really developing absolutely maximum power all the time. Refueling was allowed, of course, so the races were effectively 2 or 3 stints at basically qualifying pace all the time. It was absolutely tremendous. However, we mentioned that McLaren were in some trouble. They got absolutely trounced by Ferrari the previous season, and they wanted a clean sheet of paper. So Adrian Newey, being the designer that he is, and the brilliant designer that he is, decided, let's go a bit radical with the MP4-18. First of all, you can see the front wing here. This front wing, it looks pretty strange. You can see sort of the precursors to the spoon section on the front wings that we started to see in later years, but looking around the car, you can see side pods in particular. They are extremely narrow, aren't they? Have a look at this from above. Yeah, extremely narrow side pods. Now, these things are traits that we all see today on modern Formula One cars here in 2017, but this is 2003, remember, and these guys are running those big V10 engines. So those side pods, being as narrow as they were, they really caused a lot of problems in 2 primary manners. The first was that the car failed the mandatory FIA side crash tests, those lateral crash tests which basically determine the integrity of the monocoque. McLaren failed those. There's not much information about exactly the reasons why those crash tests were failed, but one can assume that the side pod width there, not much between the monocoque itself and the side of the side pod, therefore it is not much to imagine that the car just basically got plowed through in that T-bone test. And the knock-on effect of those very narrow side pods was that it was extremely difficult to get that engine and gearbox cool. Again, that V10 revving to the better part of 19,000 RPM with about 880 horsepower underneath. Yeah, things get really, really hot. If anyone's ever seen video of these V10 engines running, you know that the exhausts basically glow translucent at high RPM, so you've got to keep things cool. Those narrow side pods did not help McLaren in that effort. Additionally, the car was just difficult to set up. As far as I'm aware, there's not all that much information out there about the MP4-18, but it did test quite a few times throughout the season. Remember, in-season testing was allowed, You can see here, running in David Coulthard's helmet and livery here, he did, of course, have a lot of test mileage in the car, being one of the racing drivers for McLaren at that time. However, guys like Gary Paffett and Pedro de la Rosa certainly would have had some mileage in this thing. In addition to all of that, the car had knock-on electronics problems due to the heat control issues, and just generally it was just not ready for this world. So yeah, McLaren could not get the MP4-18 in anger to the racetrack at any point during the 2003 season. The MP4-17D again came back into service there, where it saw out the remainder of the 2003 season. So effectively, McLaren was running a year-old car all throughout 2003 simply because they could not get this thing to get its act together. The moral of the story, though, I suppose, is that by the end of 2003, when McLaren gave up on the MP4-18 program, most of the know-how that went into developing this car went straight into the MP4-19 and MP4-20. The MP4-19 wasn't so great either, but it was able to win Kimi Raikkonen a race at Spa, and then in 2005 with the MP4-20, Raikkonen was challenging for the Drivers' Championship up until the Brazilian Grand Prix that year. So yes, McLaren, although this was a bit of a false start, you could definitely tell that a lot was learned in the experience with the MP4-18, and therefore it did pay dividends a couple of years later in 2005. We can have a look at some of the more intricate details on this car here. You can see, first of all, those side pods. Yep, there they are. They are extremely narrow. The contrast isn't the best here, but you can see here on the model, the side pod, the exterior side, the outboard side, the side pod's where my thumb is, and then the monocoque is where my index finger is. So yeah, I know this is 1/18th scale, but just here in the modeling sense, you can see just how narrow those side pods really are relative to the sides of the monocoque. Yeah, there's not much space we're talking about there, so you wonder why those crash tests were failed. That's why there's simply not enough room to absorb all of that impact energy. Additionally to that, you can see that McLaren are trying their best to flow air through those radiators. You can see these outlets right here. We basically saw these in the forms of those outlet chimneys that we started to see in 2005. I remember them really being prevalent, and then we saw them all the way up through the end of 2008. But McLaren very clearly here intake air through the front side of the side pod, and then they're exiting it right here over this little winglet, which is designed to add a little bit more downforce to the midsection of the car. Additionally, you can see these rather conventional scoops coming from the middle of the side pods here and then up over the rear tire just to aid in clearing some of that wash and turbulence that those big tires out in the airstream cause. But really, the cool elements of this car start on the rear end. So let's have a look at the rear end. You can see double wishbone pushrod suspension on this car, front and rear. That was conventional in the day. But notice something about the top side bodywork here on the engine cover. No exhaust outlets. No, that doesn't mean that we're talking about an electric car here. No, the exhausts are down low and they are blowing the diffuser. Might be a little bit difficult to see from this angle, but the two exhaust outlets are right there in the center tunnels of the diffuser. Yeah, this is the same blown diffuser concept, and there we go, there's some light. Those are your exhaust outlets. This is exactly the same blown diffuser concept that McLaren and other teams were running in the early 90s. So the idea of this being you use the velocity of the exhaust gas to energize the flow that's already going through the diffuser at high speed, and therefore you can increase your downforce by creating an area of low pressure underneath the car right there, sucking it down. That's how a diffuser works, and that's how a blown diffuser works as well. McLaren doing this all the way up in 2003. Most teams had given up on this concept certainly by the end of 2001. Remember Gustav Brunner's Minardi PSO1, that had a blown diffuser. Here we are, Adrian Newey on the MP4-18 doing exactly the same thing. Really, really cool to see that. Additionally, you can see here we've got a beam wing on the lower section of the rear wing, and then of course the rear wing main plane right here. On the model, it's actually put together quite nicely. We've got multiple elements here. Of course, we have got the main plane itself, and then we have that upper element on that rear wing, as you can see there. Really nicely detailed here by Minichamps, I must say. Additionally to that, we can have a look into the cockpit. Obviously, David Coulthard modeled in there. You can see we've got arm detail, and we've got some leg detail, great steering wheel detail as well. Very, very nice, I must say. Minichamps always do a really good job on their cockpit detail in these Formula One models, and they certainly have not disappointed us here. And then Coulthard's helmet actually looks really, really nice as well, with all of the decals, sponsorship-wise, of the era. Additionally, decals on the car itself. You see his name there, and the Hugo Boss logo, Mobil 1, Mercedes-Benz. Yeah, this was really the end of the glory days for McLaren. Remember, this team still, to this day, has not won a Constructors' Championship all the way back to 1998. So it has been very nearly 20 years that McLaren International have failed to win the Formula One Constructors' Championship, and their last Drivers' Championship win was all the way back in 2008 with Lewis Hamilton. So really lean times for McLaren. Anyway, this three-quarter view here, very nice shot of the car in general, great sense of its proportions, and yeah, I really do like this car, even though it is a bit of an oddball, being the only car in my collection that never actually raced. Nonetheless, I think it's a really cool design study, particularly that it was designed by Adrian Newey, who of course goes all the way back to the Leighton House March days, designing those really radical cars for their era. And then obviously his career with Williams, winning world championships left and right with the FW14, FW14B, FW15C, and so on. So yes, any Adrian Newey car is a really cool addition to any model car collection. However, as we mentioned before, this car was very much ahead of its time. The narrow side pods, the blown diffuser, all of those traits. It was ahead of its time in 2003. However, Adrian Newey did not retire from Formula One after this failure. You might call it a failure, although they did learn a lot with it and it did pay dividends later. However, Adrian Newey did go to Red Bull starting in 2006, and therefore the sky was the limit. Adrian Newey, with the resources of Red Bull, was able to come back to some of these ideas, and we'll have a look at them next. Alright, so here is what I mean about being able to trace the lineage of Adrian Newey design here. On the left, of course, we have got the MP4-18, but now on the right, joining us is the 2010 Red Bull RB6. This is the car, of course, that took Sebastian Vettel to his first world championship. However, both of these cars are designed by Adrian Newey. They are built to radically different sets of regulations, as you can obviously tell from their outward appearances. Obviously, by 2010, Formula One had moved into the naturally aspirated 2.4-liter V8 formula. The engines were basically homologated, so no more engine development was really allowed. 7-speed semi-automatic gearbox remains, but the aerodynamic changes in Formula One between 2003 and 2010, plainly evident here. We've got these very wide, very low front wings now, and then these very high, very narrow rear wings. Compare just the overall appearance of these two cars. Virtually no commonality between them for the most part. In addition to that, the tires here on the McLaren are those grooved Michelins. Here we have got slick, controlled Bridgestones. Back in 2003, the tire manufacturers, Bridgestone and Michelin, were basically creating bespoke compounds and constructions for each team, but by 2010, all of that was put aside in the name of cost cutting. So Michelin was gone, in no small part to what happened in 2005 at Indianapolis, but Bridgestone became the sole tire supplier. Actually, 2010 was their last season in that capacity. However, they were producing slicks, and they were really, really, really resilient. They had the capacity to do an entire race distance. Nevertheless, both of these cars designed by Adrian Newey. Now from the front, you can't see too much commonality between them, because here you can see the 2003 spec front wing, and then here we've got the 2010 spec front wing. They are fundamentally different structures. Here on the 2010 car, you have the center section here, which is neutral, and then your outboard flanks of the wing is where the designers and aerodynamicists got the chance to play. Here, though, in 2003, the entire wing structure was basically free to develop, but you can certainly tell that the rate of development, the rate of aerodynamic know-how, and the aerodynamic development progress that happened from 03 to 2010 is absolutely huge. This 2010 wing is unbelievably complicated relative to the 2003 wing. It's effectively a single element wing here in 2003, but 2010, yeah, have a look at all of those little bits and bobs, particularly on the outboard sections of that wing. Really, really complicated stuff. However, we did mention those narrow side pods here on the MP4-18, and there they are in all of their dubious splendor. However, looking over here onto the RB6, yeah, you can see we have wider inlets on those side pods where the radiator inlets actually are. However, the car very quickly trails back into that classic Coke bottle shape that we've seen in F1 since the late 80s. You can see really there's not all that much room in those side pods. So yeah, another Adrian Newey trait. The rationale by making those side pods as narrow as feasible is to funnel more air toward the rear section of the car, in this area where I'm zooming in on right now, to feed the upper elements of the diffuser. Well, in 2010, diffusers became even more of a strategic advantage in terms of a design sense, because everybody now has to really homologate all of their engines, so it's very difficult to find a horsepower advantage, and the aero philosophy completely changed. So your rear wing is much smaller and can give you much less downforce than it could in previous years, so now you've got to claw that downforce back, and one of the ways that Adrian Newey decided to do it was to sculpt those side pods and have this free section in the floor where we are zooming into right now to funnel air in toward the diffuser. Really, really cool. Additionally here, and we'll have a look at the rear in a little while, but you can see we have now a pull rod rear suspension on this RB6. Compare that to the push rod rear suspension on the MP4-18. Really, really cool stuff. Getting the car spinning around, you can see I have parked them up pretty much lined up on the front axle. The RB6 has a slightly longer wheelbase. That is due to the fact that refueling was also banned in 2010. 2009 was the last year for refueling in Formula One, so they had to get larger fuel tanks in these cars. Now the V8 engine versus the V10 engine, the V8 was slightly more economical than the V10, so the car did need a bit more fuel on board than the V10 cars could carry, but basically, the wheelbases are basically identical here, slightly longer there on the RB6. But the longer your car is, you also have a little bit more time to play with the aerodynamics, because the car physically is traveling through a given chunk of air for a longer period, so you can manipulate that air a little bit more. Therefore, Adrian Newey has a little bit more space to play here on the RB6. As we rotate around, you can see the front suspension on both cars, push rod, double wishbone. That is par for the course in Formula One, basically going back into the late 80s. However, on the rear section, here is where we can see that contrast, and we'll stop the rotation here and get a look at that. Right here, like we talked about, the MP4-18, there's that blown diffuser, but flanked by that double wishbone push rod rear suspension. On the RB6, here we go. Double wishbone pull rod rear suspensions. A little bit difficult to see, but perhaps we can just start to catch a glimpse of the pull rod geometry going in through there. Yep, you can see the pull rod coming up between the wishbones. Really, really cool design, really, really cool geometry on that RB6. Additionally though, here is the diffuser arrangement on the RB6. You can see it is a much shallower diffuser than here on the MP4-18. Here's the RB6, completely different design, but you can still see we've got some multi-element stuff going on here through that upper tunnel. A lot of the downforce being generated through that upper tunnel, which is being fed by the floor, therefore those narrower side pods kicking in once again, and you can see the amount of space that's open now on the floor. That's feeding that upper element of the diffuser, so narrow side pods making a comeback. Of course, this car won the World Championship, and this car was basically a test mule, so definite progress being made by Mr. Newey. One thing that you will notice is being absent here are exhaust outlets. No exhaust outlets on the top side of the bodywork, nor are there exhaust outlets inside the diffuser itself. So where has Adrian Newey stuck the exhausts? Well, quite simply, he has stuffed them on the side of the car right there. And we'll get a light on that in a moment once we can stop the rotation. However, Adrian Newey has stuck his exhaust right there, roughly center of picture, once we focus again. Come on, do the focusing thing. Almost there. Almost. Roughly center of picture. Yeah, that little recessed area. It's very difficult to see, but look at the lower wishbone and then immediately below it, that recessed area. That's your exhaust outlet. It is right in the midst of the diffuser area. So we once again have a blown diffuser on an Adrian Newey car. Now, 2011 was an even more critical year for blown diffusers because they were starting to blow the diffusers off throttle. So basically what they were doing was a glorified anti-lag system, as you would see on a turbocharged engine, to keep the turbo spooled up when the car is off throttle. But essentially what they were doing was they were keeping the throttles open on these engines while the car is decelerating, so the driver's not commanding any power. But what they were doing instead was cutting the fuel injection and cutting the spark, but keeping the throttles open, thus to maintain flow of air through the engine at all times, and therefore to blow the diffuser, energize the diffuser a little bit more. As a side effect, Red Bull in particular were able to generate crazy downforce in almost all running conditions, but we also had these cars sounding really dramatic in 2011. Renault, I remember, had a forward exit exhaust. They were blowing the front of the floor on their car, basically this section here, right at the rear trailing edge of the barge board. However, Red Bull were running those exhausts straight through the diffuser in 2011, just like McLaren were doing there with the exhaust blowing through the diffuser. And yeah, really cool. Created those machine gun type backfire sounds. Absolutely awesome stuff. However, that's about all I've got here about these cars. I hope you found that interesting. I wanted to talk about the MP4-18, but it never raced. However, I think it's a really cool design study, particularly because of its designer, Adrian Newey, and a lot of the ideas on it were half-baked in 2003, but as we can see here with the RB6 from 2010 winning the World Championship, drivers and constructors, yeah, a lot of those ideas on the MP4-18 did come to fruition a little bit later on down the line. It just goes to show you that if you are in the business of building stuff, designing stuff, you should never, ever throw anything away, because someday it just might be useful. However, until next time, thank you all very much for watching. FerrariMan601 saying thanks, and we will see you soon.